What up, though? Dwayne Barnes, MPA, here back for another week of AAS. Or let me start it right. African American Studies 477, Protest and Power, Session 2, School Desegregation, 1965 through 1962. Today, we're going to be talking about the Little Rock Nine and James Meredith. A lot of really good things in our conversation today. I want to thank everyone for joining me that's here today. I want to welcome those who it's your first time joining and give you a little bit about the course, and then we're going to move right into our content today. So African American Studies 477, Power and Protest, Civil Rights Movement, 1954, I'll say today, through 1968, is a course, virtual course authored by myself. As you know, or if you don't know, I was African American Studies major at Howard and at EMU, Eastern Michigan University, when I went there. And this is a calling, it's a lifestyle, it's a passion, and it's something that I've always loved. In our recent political and social times, we're being faced with issues that we haven't seen since these days. And so I wanted to contribute to the movement by providing a baseline of education for all kind of people, those who are just getting into this kind of stuff, those who have a basis in it and just need kind of a refresher, and those who are knee deep in it and just want to have a community of people to be able to go through and talk about some of these issues with. Last week, week one, we talked about the murder of Emmett Till and his trial, and then we talked about the victory of the Montgomery bus boycott. Today, we'll be talking about school desegregation. And so, sit down, hold on tight, and get ready for a really good conversation. Before we jump into any of the good stuff, I want to hit us with a couple of our objectives for the course. Our course objectives are to, one, critically analyze the strategies, tactics, and philosophies employed by the civil rights movement, to understand the historical context of racial segregation and discrimination in the United States, to examine the key roles and figures and organizations that were a part of this movement, to explore the complexities of social change and the challenges faced by the activists who were doing it. And then finally, to foster critical thinking and discussion about the legacy of the civil rights movement. Another kind of way to look at it is I like to look at the people, the events, the laws, and the impact that they had. So this course is going, like I said earlier, from 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education all the way to 1968 with the signing of the Voting Rights Act. So this is a chance to kind of go through that conversation and share. I want it to be a two-way conversation, to share what we know and to share what we like to know, and then move forward in that regard. So today, that was there. So that's what we're talking about today. So I want to start each week with just a quick wrap up of the week before. So let me change my deck here. And so, like I said, last week we talked about the seeds of civil rights, the murder of Emmett Till, and the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just want to kind of level set so we can know kind of how things work, as far as time goes. And then also I want us to keep these themes as we move forward. Feel free to drop any questions or anything you have in the chat and say, what up, though, whatever, we good. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me and everybody is ready to take this ride. So let me pull up the information and be ready to roll. All right. So we started with the murder of Emmett Till, and I think it's important to think about his legacy. Think about, hello, what up? Think about his legacy. Think about, everything we kind of touched on last week. A 14-year-old boy went down south to go see his family, found himself lynched, and it sparked a movement. And I'm kind of being tongue-in-cheek with that, but, due to the factors of what happened with the trial and the aftermath, it did in fact start, a movement. And so I want to think about it in a couple different ways. Outside the shocking brutality, just the hierarchy of race and down south that was hard to deal with, and finding the courage to deal with it came to the forefront in dealing with this movement. Outside of just, well, I'll say this, the way that the family handled showcasing what happened down south, with the open casket funeral, it really allowed for us to be reminded of how brutal it really was. And when we think about the trial, and we watched that video last week of the trial, all white jury down south was never going to find two white men guilty of killing a black man. And it was something that really, hit hard with our people, and it also hit hard through the press. And so as we moved forward, we saw that after the two gentlemen were found not guilty, they ended up doing an interview where they admitted to lynching and killing this young man for, I think it was $4,000. And they talked about how it happened and all the details. So just kind of bringing back home, it is what it is. And I think it was interesting because down south, people kind of understood, what happens when you're down there. But up north, we got a chance to get our eyes on it and, start to think about how we wanted to navigate through a process of, not having to live that way anymore. And especially with the role of the media. Oh, man, at that time, the Black press was our press. So the Chicago Defender, Jet Magazine, et cetera, NACP's The Crisis, not letting it die, keeping it up, keeping it through the news cycle, ensuring that eyes were on it was really starting to one, not let it just be another murder that's gone, but one that can spark something moving forward. So the role of the Black media, and we'll talk more about how civil rights leaders use media and press to leverage and navigate what it is that they were trying to get done. And like I said earlier, the long-term galvanizing impact of this trial, this lynching, this trial, we said, 3 months after this, the Montgomery bus boycott kicked off. So it was a seminal moment. It had to come. I said it last week. We turned tragedy to triumph. So it was something that was tragic when it happened, but it ended up, being one of the things that really sparked us in our ability to navigate moving forward. And then I think, one of the more important parts of this conversation are those people who were everyday people who spoke up. So we're talking about Moses Wright, who was his uncle, Emmett's uncle, who stood up in a courtroom and identified a white man as killing somebody in a courtroom in Mississippi. That means something. Willie Reed, another young man who saw what happened, who stood up on the witness stand. Charles Diggs Jr., who was a congressman from here in Michigan, who brought the national spotlight. Anytime a congressman is sitting in on something like that, it brought a national spotlight to the appeal. And somebody who don't get their just due, T.R.M. Howard. He was a prominent surgeon and civil rights leader in Mississippi who played a significant role he in the investigation. He provided resources, organized witnesses, ensured the story would get to a wider audiences, and his home became a safe haven for all those involved. And then finally, the local members of the community who, held together, who ended up boycotting and putting that store out of business where Emmett supposedly had an interaction with the white woman, and who stood in the face of, having to live that life. Mamie Till was going back up north. Some of the others left, but, they were there to live there. So just the fact that they, stood strong and kind of navigated that process is something that, I really want to bring home in this class. It was average, everyday people. The leaders came in and everybody did what they did, but it was more about the people who lived there, those who were brave enough to stand up. Because back then they didn't know, like, we're looking at everything hindsight and it's 2020. Oh, this happened, that happened, that happened. Then they signed this bill. Well, when this was happening, that wasn't the case. So let's transition into the Montgomery bus boycott. Again, we're just wrapping up from last week. And you think about a couple of really big things beyond Rosa Parks. We talked about this a bit last week. While Rosa Parks, her stance to not get up out of her seat did kick off the Montgomery bus boycott, but there were others I mentioned last week. Claudine Colvin, a 15-year-old who refused to give up her seat 9 months before Rosa Parks. Her case didn't become the catalyst, but it was one that got the ball rolling. Another courageous act of a teenager, and we'll talk more about that today. Mary Louise Smith, another young woman who refused to give up her seat a few months after Claudine. Her actions demonstrated a growing resistance to segregation. So, while Rosa Parks gets the go ahead and the nod, there were other young women who were, sick and tired of handling that business. Next, you think about the NAACP. So the NAACP has been a character in all of what we're doing. The Emmett Till case, the Legal Defense Fund, and ensuring that, they were able to move forward. In Birmingham, people were a part of the NAACP. E.D. Nixon was the state president for the NAACP. And they always used the Brown versus the board. They were the legal power and legal mind behind that. And we'll talk about more of their legal power as we get into both of our conversations today. And then this is an organization that I think really needs to come to the forefront, the Women's Political Council. Black women who are organized in Alabama. Miss Joanne Robinson, you see the picture right over here to the right, who was a key player in organizing that boycott. Because we're dealing with the church, women, especially our sisters, always had a big, large hand in the church. And the Montgomery bus boycott wouldn't have been what it was without the help of the Political Women's Council and Joanne Robinson. So definitely giving shots out to her and that organization for keeping, everybody organized and ready to roll. And then the Montgomery Improvement Association. We talked about them a bit last week, who a group of ministers and leaders who decided on Dr. King to be the leader. And, working through their many committees. We always hear about the faithful few, but we're talking about the numerous individuals that served on committees, handling transportation, fundraising, communications, and morale, and grassroots organizing to keep the boycott rolling. The role of the Black church, we'll get to that part. And then also thinking about the logistics that they move through, the drivers, the coordinators, the carpools, the shoe donation networks, the fundraising, all the things that had to happen to ensure that the Montgomery bus boycott would keep going the way that it did. And then finally, or next to finally, the economic impact. These were the nameless cooks, maids, workers who were willing to do whatever it took to not get on that bus, to boycott the stores, and to ensure they were also, given into the cost to make sure everything could move forward. So when we think about it, we all think about Dr. King and the leaders, but it was average, everyday people who lived there, and descendants probably still live there, who had and played a huge effort in getting this accomplished. And then also, we want to always talk about the law when we're talking about civil rights. Civil rights was a fight in the courtroom just as much as it was a fight on the ground. So the landmark case, Browder versus Gale, and its significance. Browder versus Gale resulted in a pivotal Supreme Court decision that declared segregation on public buses unconstitutional, reinforcing the legal foundation for civil rights, as everyone started to pull from, as the movement started to keep going. And then the role of the Black church can't be stated enough. After you picketed and you protested and you walked, you had to go get your soul fed. You had to have leadership. You had to have people there who were ready to serve. And that's what the church did. Spiritual leadership, community mobilization, and advocacy for justice. It was the civil rights movement wouldn't have been what it was without the power, the authority, and the organizing of the Black church. And so I'll skip this and we'll move on. We'll get back to that as we move forward in our conversation. But I really want to take a moment to frame that discussion. So now today, we're going to get to what's on our menu for today here. Let's get that up. And if you got any questions, throw them in the chat. Anything you heard, anything that sparked your attention, throw it in the chat and we can move forward with answering those. So today, we're talking about, I call it a battlefield classroom. We're taking the fight from off the buses, and we're taking it right to the classroom. And you'll hear me mention this again, Brown v. Board. That's our seminal piece of law that's moving a lot of this stuff forward. So Brown v. Board of Education simply took segregation and annihilated it and said that separate but equal classrooms are unconstitutional, and you have to navigate a process to end that. And we'll see later in the conversation that while Brown v. Board did say, schools desegregate or school segregation was unconstitutional, it didn't necessarily lay out a platform to do it. So it was at the bequest of each state to have to figure out how to navigate that process. Again, the role of the NAACP in the desegregation efforts, The NAACP was the legal fund that put together the lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall, to even fight the fight in court, bringing it through several states and finally to the Supreme Court, and ensuring that it was held at that level, that it was enforced at that level. And so once the Brown v. Board decision was passed down, it faced resistance. It faced, we need to continual advocacy on it. And it wasn't a situation where, okay, well, the law said it, so we're going to do it. And you'll see more in our conversation today. It was a fight, even though this was the law of the land. We still had to have that fight. And so when you hear about sometimes the issue around federal law versus state rights, states' rights in this case was saying, hell no, we ain't doing that. And while the federal was saying, yeah, you have to. And we'll see how those two buck against each other in these two cases that we'll look at today. So I definitely want to set the stage a little bit here. So let me take this down and I'll bring it right back up here in a moment. So I definitely want to set the stage a little bit before we get into, all the great details. So I like to talk about these issues with the people, the laws, and the impact. So the people, or the case studies we'll talk about today, will be the Little Rock Nine, which is Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Gloria Ray Carmark, I always mess that one up, Thomas Jefferson, Melba Patillo Beals, Minnie Jean Brown, Terrence Roberts, Thelma Mothershed, and Daisy Lee and Gaston Bates. And we'll also talk about Ms. Daisy Bates from the state NAACP, James Hicks from the Amsterdam News, also Alex Wilson, who was with them, President Eisenhower, and Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas. So the gradual plan. So in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education passed, or was the law of the land. The Supreme Court ruled that school segregation was illegal. And so, the Little Rock School Board said, okay, well, we have a gradual plan of getting this going. We want to have 6 years to implement this. And to make a long story short, having to push the issue, 27 students attempted to enroll into various Little Rock schools, kind of pushing the issue. And, they were rebuffed, rejected. And so 27 lawsuits at the hands of the NAACP came in front of the courts, and they were all upheld. However, the 6-year window that they wanted to use to implement their gradual plan was pushed and said, now we want to see this happen in 1957 and no later. And so, as an affront to that, the Southern power structure, the senators and congressmen, state legislators, they wrote a document called the Southern Manifesto. And the Southern Manifesto denounced the Supreme Court's decision and encouraged other state leaders, other people in the state to push and resist against desegregation. So they're saying, we don't give a about federal precedent. We're going to do what we want to do. Kind of hearing some of that in politics today. Kind of interesting. And so in 1956, in August, the district court upheld the gradual desegregation plan. But despite that appeal, the federal appellate court upheld the gradual plan and called for desegregation in September 1957. So that starts to get us right into our conversation. Another interesting part is the NAACP, who was brought the lawsuit and working through this, and said, you know what, we're not just going to let 9 random students get picked. In the school district, like, well, we're not going to allow that either. So it was kind of a back and forth between who would be these later coined Little Rock Nine. So the NAACP said, we have the perfect kind of fit. We know who should be there. We know what should happen. We know what should be there. Well, the school said, okay, well, we know what they should be too. They should live here. They should have good grades. They should have this. They said, of course, we wouldn't. That's what we do. We ain't worried about that. And so these 9 children were picked. And I have to say children, teenagers. These are going to high school. So between 15 and 17 years old. These are children we're talking about, faced with having to carry this burden. And so once, both sides vetted them, the process gets started here. Battlefield Classroom, Little Rock Nine. And so we'll definitely talk about their significance and how federal intervention and its impact went a long way in this regard. Okay, before we get to my girl, Miss Daisy Bates, we're gonna hold it up. So now we get to September 4th, day after my birthday, 1957, and these 9 students were looking to do their legal right of going to school. Going to school, not, we'll get to that, but going to school. You've probably seen the picture, and I'm gonna show it a little bit later, of Miss Elizabeth Eckford being surrounded by all these people while she's going to school. So 8 of them got together and were carpooling. That morning, Elizabeth missed a call and said, well, I'm just headed to school. So while they were carpooling, everyone but her, she walked to school surrounded by a mob, grown folks, students, community people with looking to do harm, and, surrounded her and gave her death threats and end threats and all of this stuff, and refused, and make a long story short, they refused to allow those students into the room. Governor Fabus, who was the governor of Arkansas, who was using this as a political tool and something that, clearing his conscience on it, saying, look, we're not doing it. We don't care what you say. We're not doing it. Y'all not getting in here. And so a problem ensued because, one, you had that Southern Manifesto who said, we ain't doing it. We encourage y'all not to do it as well. Stand up, fight what's happening. And then you had the federal government who was supposed to enforce this order, walking on eggshells, saying, we don't know. So one half is being, which is the Arkansas Southern oligarchy, or whatever you want to call them at that time. They were revving themselves up into a frenzy over not doing it. You had the NAACP looking to hold together this law and say federal courts enforce this. And then you had the students kind of hanging in the balance with their life on the line every single day. So they try to get to school. It doesn't work. A mob ensues, threats are going, and the federal government wasn't willing to make their voice heard at that moment. And people were blaming President Eisenhower. This is on you. You said this is you carry out federal law. You got to handle this. And so he militarized, or he brought out the Arkansas National Guard and said, no, hold the door. These kids aren't getting in here. And so this started a negotiation between President Eisenhower and the governor of Arkansas, trying to get on the same page about, getting this thing done. And to make a long story short, after they went back and forth, President Eisenhower was under the impression that integration was going to happen. So September 15th, 1957, the students, this is their second time around, looking to, get inside of the school so they could go to school and just do reading, writing, and arithmetic. You know what I'm saying? Just go to school. This time a mob ensued outside. They were attempting to try to find the students and do harm to them and allow for them to be, in the crosshairs. Well, to make a long story short, the students didn't get in that time. The governor and the president had to get back on the phone and have a conversation, which ended in the President Eisenhower calling on federalizing the Alabama National Guard and bringing in the 101st Battalion to ensure that the students got into the school. So the day that the riot ensued, a lot of crazy stuff was happening. They were trying to get their hands on the students. They were trying to get their hands on any supporters or anybody who they thought was near them. They were trying to find where the students were. And one of the things that happened was, again, the black press was covering this event that was going on, the Amsterdam News. And one of the people who were with the editor of the Amsterdam News caught a brick to the head. People was fighting, trying to flip over cars, just acting a fool because they didn't want their way of life, as they call it, to be interrupted. So to make a long story short, the federal troops got there and they ensured that the students were able to able to go to school. And so imagine trying to go to school, and this is the tension that comes along with it. We're not talking about class. We ain't talking about extracurricular activities. We aren't talking about your parents. We aren't talking about none of that stuff, just to get into school. So once they finally got to school, their safety was still an issue. So for the remainder of the school year, we're talking from September until the end of the school year, they had to deal with this crazy environment. So they had soldiers escorting them to class every single day. So I'm going to math. I got a soldier with me. Left math, headed to English. A soldier is with me. And still during that time, you're hearing the snickering and the pispering and the whispering by your fellow classmates that they don't want you here, that you don't belong here, et cetera, et cetera. So much for these kids to have to take on. I'm so glad that they had a resource in their corner and a person in their corner who could hold them down. Miss Daisy Bates, she was the president of the state NAACP. She was their leader. She was their mentor. She was their PR person. She was their support. She was their, they organized at her home every day. She was their chauffeur. She brought them to school every day. She made sure they got home from school. She was the glue that made sure that they were taken care of, that the NAACP were linked in and stayed abreast of what was going on, and that everything was moving in the way that it should. So Miss Daisy Bates, through, imagine the daily toll that took. I don't know if my students are going to make it home. I don't know if what's going to happen. I don't know. Just dealing with kids and just the infighting that comes with having nobody else to lay your burdens on but each other. So Miss Daisy Bates played a great role in ensuring that they were able to navigate the process. So you finally get to like December and, starting to get close to Christmas time and things are wearing thin. And Ernest and Minnie Jean Brown were headed to the cafeteria one day like they always were. And they had somebody, just whispering and pispering in their ear, getting sick and tired of it. And that was the day Minnie Jean Brown couldn't take it no more. She was in the lunch line trying to get a bowl of chili so she can go to class and enjoy the rest of her day. Couldn't take it no more, took the chili, dumped it on the kid's head. The whole lunchroom went silent. And the staff, which is usually people who look like us, started, cheering and being happy that finally somebody stood up and didn't handle it. Now, unfortunately, that meant that Miss Minnie Jean Brown would have to leave the Little Rock Nine and didn't, finish that year. But she had enough and said, look, this is it. I can't. What did Popeye say? I stood all I can stand and I can't stand no more. That's what she had to do. And so she really, really, reached her peak. And I'm sure many of them did. And, and I'm not mad at her for doing what she had to do. So the year wound on, the year moved on, and we were finally about to get to graduation. But let's take a step back. So again, September 2nd, the governor deployed the National Guard and said, I ain't letting them up in here. September 4th was the first day of school, and they were turned away. And that's the picture of Elizabeth Eckford getting confronted by that mob. September 4th, the federal government had, caught their criticism, like, where y'all at? Y'all not helping. The 24th, the Eisenhower dispatched the 121st Airborne Division to let the kids go in. The federal troops allowed for the mob to desist and for the kids to get in. And then it takes us to our special time here of, let me take this down. Finally to May 27th, May 29th, 1958, the next year. The first Black graduate, Ernest Green, of the Little Rock Nine, was the first Black graduate to cross that stage. So after a year like no other, Ernest graduated. He was the only senior in that group. And there was a lot of issues around what would happen. They didn't know if that place was going to get firebombed. They didn't know if somebody was going to try to shoot. They didn't know what was going on. And so he, when he walked across the stage and when he graduated, nobody said a thing. Nobody said a word. And he was just standing there having to just deal with it. But according to him, he said, you know what? I didn't care. I got from them what I needed and I was ready to go. And that was just it. So he graduated, and a lot of interesting things happened after that. So after he graduated, being the first African-American to graduate from Little Rock, Arkansas High, or Central High in Little Rock, the next year, per the plan, it was supposed to be another year of integration. But across the South, and especially here in Arkansas, the governor closed the schools, all public high schools, all public schools for the 1958-59 school year. And so they said, well, rather than having to deal with this integration stuff, we closing it. And they call it the lost year. And it was an interesting thing, like cutting your nose off to spite your face. And this happened in Virginia. This happened in Arkansas. This happened in North Carolina, I believe. So, to fight segregation or integration, they said, we closing the school. So nobody went to school during that time because they said, we're not integrating. So they called that the lost year. Now the feds deemed that unconstitutional and that the schools had to open. And so the year after that it did, and things proceed. The process went forward. So, it was a very interesting time when you think about, you'd rather close the schools than allow for the children to go. And again, it happened in Charlottesville, in Norfolk. So Virginia was a part of this. It was crazy. Until the fall of I'll say this. So that's the story for the Little Rock Nine. Now, if you go back and you'll see a video that I'm going to play here momentarily, you'll see that was a traumatic experience for the Little Rock Nine. And I bet they were happier than anybody else that they didn't have to go back and deal with none of that stuff for the next year. So, the 58, 59 year was out. So the 60 year came, and 4 little girls enrolled in the first grade in New Orleans, and there was a citywide riot. Now, this lined up perfectly in politics, because then you had a young man running for office by the name of John F. Kennedy. And so in his plight to become president at the Democratic National Convention, he spoke on the issues of Negro issues, they called them during the day. Like, man, how can you say this is the kind of country we have when we don't even have the freedoms to move and get an education? Some said it was genuine. Some said it was more tongue-in-cheek, and he was doing what he had to do to get votes. We'll hear more about his plight as we go through these next couple of cases. So the lasting impact of the Little Rock Nine, I think, was one, Ernest Green's graduation showed the Emmett Till generation that they were heading to college, and they had a new fight brewing. It also highlighted deep resistance to desegregation in the South and the need for the federal government to keep their part of the deal and implementing a lot of these things. The courage and the resilience by those young children were something that inspired others around the country, because this wasn't just happening, like I said, in a nutshell. These things are happening concurrently. So as people are going into Little Rock, they're going to be going to New Orleans. They were going to Charlottesville and Greensboro and all these places around the South. So just imagine, now we laud children for getting NIL deals and playing college football and getting a scholarship. Well, back then they were, really changing the world. So, I just want to give the props and the honor to the Little Rock Nine for what they did. And I also want to take a moment and kind of summarize what we talked about and play this little short clip of a video, about 2 minutes, and then we'll move on to the rest of the content here. So give me just a moment and we can get this video going. And again, if you have any questions, any comments, throw them in the chat and we can discuss that. All right, 60-year look back at the Little Rock Nine.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words. And I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South ought to change.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will.
The governor of the state, Orville Forbes, decided that he was going to use Central as his point of resistance. None of us of the 9 anticipated that the resistance would be as strong as it was. The night before we were to go to school, the governor called out the Arkansas National Guard, unbeknownst to us. And when we appeared at Central the first day,
Sealed off.
The National Guard was there to bar our entrance and let white students go into the school. What it was like, it was rejection that I had never experienced like that. It seemed to me that if they were going to all of this trouble to keep me out, there was something bigger than my simply going to class. Only when we got home from school that day did we realize what an ordeal, personal ordeal, Elizabeth had gone through, and that she certainly faced more of the mob directly. I always applaud the fact that she was able to keep both her composure and try to figure out how to get out of that. We started school on the 25th of September.
President Eisenhower sends 500 troops of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army.
It was a terrific feeling that President of the United States would send troops to escort us into school. I didn't know what was going to happen after that. It was like going to war every day. You had students who tried to use as much verbiage as they could to intimidate us. We had threats and comments that, we would be killed. For all of us, we decided that this was a year that we were going to support each other. We were going to try to do as well as we could in our academic work. Some were a lot smarter than me, but I also was determined that this year I was going to graduate from Central. The principal of the school told me at one point along the way that I didn't have to come to the ceremony. They would mail me my diploma. And I thought, listen, I didn't go through all this to pass up the ceremony. Maybe the world thought that after Little Rock, everything is going to be fixed. And one of the important pieces, I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone, that the history of slavery in this country makes it very difficult to overcome a lot of issues on race. We're a long way from being perfect, but we certainly are not what we were when I started out. I believe that our participation at Central is one of those many steps that's gone to change this country for the better.
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, that was, the plight of the Little Rock Nine. And I think more than anything else, that started us down this road of school integration that would definitely come to a head here as we talk about James Meredith and his integration into the University of Mississippi, which I call Ole Miss. I know it from a football perspective, but this was as you'll see, as we talk about this and as we move forward, Mississippi was one of the strongholds of the South, along with Alabama, and all the other ones that, really said, we're fighting this thing and we're not moving forward in that regard. We're not going to do it. And so let's take a stab into our good friend James Meredith and his plight into integrating the University of Mississippi. And for this one, we're going to really focus in on James Meredith, the man, Medgar Evers, his mentor through this situation, who we'll talk about later in our class. And then we'll talk about the governor of Mississippi, Governor Barrett, and we'll talk about JFK. He played a really big role in this situation. So again, as in any kind of situation here, you had a legal case that kind of moved things forward. So in 1962, James Meredith, let's take a step back. James Meredith looked to find to get an education in his home state of Mississippi after serving the United States in the Army. This situation, you'll see federal versus state authority, and you'll see the impact on civil rights legislation as we move forward through the different cases. So one, the significance of his enrollment, breaking the color line, as we saw with Little Rock Nine. And if you're with me for the last class, you saw with Jackie Robinson, you saw with military service, you saw with military contract jobs in the 40s. So we're starting to see a lot of these walls being broken. We're going to see the role of the federal government and JFK from enforcing what they were supposed to. JFK's commitment to civil rights for whatever reason, we'll talk about that, and then the legacy of federal authority in that situation. So again, the events of September 62. Before we get to September 62, let's get back to the lawsuit before we get there. So let's take a step back here and take this down and talk for a moment. So this was another situation that was crafted and planned and very strategic and very intentional about how it came up. It wasn't just some man walked up to the University of Mississippi and said, I want to go to college here, and we did it. As with the other cases, the NAACP knew that they had to have the right person. They knew that they had to have the right cause, and it had to be at the right time. So Medgar Evers, the state president of the NAACP, he attempted to, right after the Brown v. Board of Education, he attempted to integrate the University of Mississippi and was denied, and took the case to court. And then the court said, well, no, you didn't get in because of race. You just got in because you couldn't get in, or, you know, whatever reason like that. So he said, okay, well, cool. A few years later, you got James Meredith, who meets every requirement you're supposed to, intellectual, an army man, well-spoken, somebody, if you would with the old class, the new Negro kind of a person, uppity kind of young man who knew what he wanted in the world, and you had the right one. And so he, and I'm talking about James Meredith, he attempts to apply and enroll. They turn him away and they file suit. Now, this was a very sticky kind of situation. So the court battle, you know, like the rest of them we see here, you know, that's why I love this. One of my favorite parts of civil rights is the court battles. In 1962, the court battle that allowed for Meredith to attend Ole Miss stemmed from a series of legal challenges initiated by Meredith and the NAACP. So he's walking in there with two of the lawyers that argue Brown v. Board. So he walking in there with some big dogs, you know, to have this fight all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so the case was Meredith versus Fair. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed a lawsuit arguing that Ole Miss's rejection was based on racial discrimination and violated equal protection. So we're now back to the 14th Amendment, talking about equal protection under the law. Well, the lower court initially sided with the university, stating that Meredith was not denied because of his race. However, the U.S. Appeals Court for the Fifth Circuit reversed that decision, ordering Ole Miss to admit Meredith. And so another appeal happened, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the case went to the Supreme Court in 1962. And the appeals court stood with that decision that Ole Miss must admit James Meredith. In good old Mississippi, the Supreme Court is saying that you got to let a black man up in this thing. Not kids and teenagers. So the man who used to be your property, the man who used to be your sharecropper, the man who used to be your boy, the man who used to be all this stuff, he coming to school with your kids now, like in a university that, you know, for them at that time was a premier university in the state. So that was a shock to the way of life. And if you looked at, you know, if you went with me through the last class, you saw what happened during Reconstruction, where the North was saying, well, this is what y'all gonna be doing down there. So they starting to get a little bit of that in their stomach. They starting to get, you know, their leaders saying, we don't care, we not integrating, all this other stuff. So you're starting to really get a frenzy going, and you got people's lives in the balance that got to deal with this stuff. So the legal fight started, and in 62, James Meredith attempted to enroll. And Governor Barrett said, hell no, we ain't about to do that. And so he said, I'm standing up. I'm personally going to stand up for this. This is a conviction of mine. I don't care what you say. I'll stand at the door and see to it that he's not enrolled. So September, he goes to enroll, and the governor is there and saying, nah, I'm not. Now, he didn't beat him over the head to tell you all that. He didn't do all that. But he said, no, I'm not going to allow for you to enroll. He said, okay, well, cool. We'll continue to move forward in our regard. And so they said, well, you know, like we did last time, who's going to enforce this measure? We're supposed to be able to get here. We're supposed to be able to enjoy the ability to get education, but we can't do that without the federal government's pushing this thing through. And so the governor and JFK were getting on the line to try to figure this out. Now the story goes that JFK didn't really want to have to do nothing with it. He wanted it to handle itself because he had other things to worry about. And so you're setting up another situation where you got a mob brewing, you got people not happy with this outcome, you got, you know, the frenzy riled up, and you're not willing to get in the waters and do what it is you're supposed to do to ensure that this stuff is going. And so they would get on the phone and they would talk. The governor would try to play two ends against the middle because, one, that's the president, so you got to respect the president. But you also have to kind of keep your state in line too. So James Meredith tries to walk in here. It's a mob brewing. It's people ready to take him out. It's people ready to hurt him. It's people ready to hurt people involved. It's people ready to try to put somebody up on a string. Strange fruit. They had a taste for it. And so you're having to protect yourself. You're having to protect the situation. These students are feeling like their rights are being violated. James Meredith feeling like his rights are being violated. And so you're having a recipe that isn't coming up the way that you want to see it. So the federal government said, they said, okay, look, we don't want to get our university closed by the federal government for not allowing him in. So let's see what we can do here. So a second attempt came and said, okay, well, this time he left from the Oxford campus and went to the Jackson campus of University of Mississippi to register. He was met there by the governor and a mob again saying, you're not going to register here. You're not going to get in. You're not doing it. You're not doing it. And so we like, okay, well, you know, what's going to happen? So JFK gets on the phone again with the governor and say, look, man, I thought we had an understanding. I thought we had this. I thought we had this going. I thought we was headed in the right direction. He's saying, well, you know, you got to wait, man. We can't. If people are riled up, they're not feeling it. We can't do it. He's like, I don't care about. I'm the federal government. You do what I tell you to do. Well, we need some time. We need some time. What you need? 2 weeks? You need some time? Okay, we may give you some time. We're getting this thing done. Well, I can't promise either way. This is the governor from Mississippi. Well, I can't promise it either way, but I hear you, Mr. President. And so, you know, as we know, I guess I knew this, but I didn't know how deep it went. So as the year's going on, the football season is happening. And so Ole Miss has a game against Kentucky. And if you know anything about SEC football, if you follow sports, they always say, you know, football is a religion in the South. And at this moment, it was too. So the students go off to watch the football game, a game out in Oxford for Mississippi against Kentucky, good old SEC football. And at that time, you know, JFK said, look, I'm tired of waiting. Let's push the issue and let's get this done. So you got an interesting thing happening. So this is squirrel hunting. Well, two things. One, when each time James Meredith goes to enroll, you have more and more people from the community, more and more people from the state, more and more people who believe in the cause of segregation starting to find their way on campus and get information and say, look, we ain't allowing for this to happen. So you got more people around looking to do bad. It's squirrel hunting season. So every pickup truck you see got a couple of guns in it, just so they can go do their hunting, but also to do some other nefarious acts. And then you got this football season, I guess, you know, not that this matters, but Ole Miss was having an undefeated season, one of the best seasons they had at that time. And so everybody was riled up to go see the football team. So the team, everybody's going to see the team, they go leave. Well, while everybody's gone, JFK said, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to federalize the National Guard or federalize the troops and send them there. And then I'm also going to give an address so people will know what's going on. Now, not many people heard the address that night, but the country, not many people down there in Mississippi. So when the students get home, to make a long story short, when the students get home from the game, they see the federal troops lined up. And basically, like we've said several other times, a riot ensued. So you're talking about Molotov cocktails, you're talking about shotguns, and the troops, the federal troops were told not to shoot, not to do none of that stuff, not to just kind of hold the peace. So, you know, they call this the Battle at Oxford of 1962, kind of bringing up these civil rights these Civil War kind of notions. And so you had a violent kind of situation. You ended up with, during that night, 35 marshals were shot, 2 killed. But by dawn, the mob had cleared and the federal troops held rank. And make a long story short, the door was open for James Meredith to register and to walk in. The next morning, he walked in and he registered and he enrolled, and he was a student at the University of Mississippi. Now, of course, you know, this wasn't an easy task. This wasn't something that was easily done. And every day of his time there, he had to have federal troops monitor him 24/7 to ensure that he would stay safe and ensure that he get the education that he deserved. On, I believe it was December or June, 1963, he graduated from, he being James Meredith, graduated from University of Mississippi with a degree in political science. And we'll talk about him later as we move on. This situation was a case of federal versus states' rights. It was a situation where segregation was being fought at every turn. While we were watching it at home, Black folks, we were hoping, praying, fighting for him to get through. And on the other side, they were doing the same. So you had two kind of juxtapositions there. And when he finally was able to enroll, it really made people get a very sour taste in their mouth down south for JFK, who would later end up meeting, a bullet down south, ironically, and where the fight in Mississippi would continue on. Wait, before we get to the conclusion, I want to show this video and then we'll come back to it. So we talked a lot about that. I'm looking at the chat here. Okay, cool. Thank you. I like that. I'm gonna show a quick video on James Meredith and his enrollment, and then we're going to tie it together. Then we're gonna wrap it up and we're gonna be out of here for the day. So let's look at James Meredith and his enrollment into the University of Mississippi. All right, here we go. Oh, hold on, it's not sharing. 1 second. Put the wrong one up to share. Present, share screen. James Meredith, there we go.
In June 1962, a United States Court of Appeals ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith. It would take numerous attempts that year before the 29-year-old Air Force veteran and Mississippi native would become the first Black student at Ole Miss. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett, a segregationist, personally blocked Meredith's first two attempts to enroll. Mississippi's lieutenant governor stopped his third attempt. Meredith's fourth attempt sparked violent riots, which left 2 people dead and several injured. On October 1st, 1962, federal marshals sent by President John F. Kennedy successfully escorted Meredith to enroll. They also accompanied him to classes. While Meredith gained entrance into the school, he didn't gain acceptance. Students were told it was their constitutional right to refuse to socialize or fraternize with an undesirable student. Meredith would endure ongoing isolation, harassment, and violence. Even his family was targeted. A bullet fired into his home nearly injured his teenaged sister. Despite the hostility, Meredith remained steadfast, and on August 18, 1963, became the first Black to graduate from the University of Mississippi, earning a degree in political science.
Yeah, back in the day, our ancestors and people who, were fighting for just the right to do the things that we do all the time. How many of us, have gone to college? How many of us graduated, went back again? How many of us, were able to go down south and go to HBCU or go down to a PWI and just enjoy if your test scores and your GPA, and you were lucky enough to get in to go, not a riot ensuing, not, federal courts having to marshal things back and forth, but just, just thinking about the determination and the expertise and the guts that people had to have during that time is inspiring to me, because again, we're living in times that are going to call for that kind of determination and grit. So, this was really two things, and I missed one thing earlier, but I can tie them both together. Three things I think that are big takeaways here. One, the importance of federal authority and civil rights. Even going back to Reconstruction, all that stuff came from a federal level. The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. These were federal precedents that had to be implemented in the South. Now, during Reconstruction, a part of Reconstruction and allowing states to get back into the Union was they had to write into their state constitutions, these people are free, they do have equal protection, and they can vote, which was, eventually kind of eroded away. But it was always a federal, impetus that allowed for this to happen. And the civil rights movement leveraged those federal powers to get states powers everywhere we go. We looked at Birmingham. We looked at now Little Rock. Now we're looking at Oxford and Jackson, Mississippi. All of these states, if it was up to them, they would have said, hell no, we ain't doing that. So it took, federal power. Another power, and I don't know if it's here or not, the role of activism and social change, the courage of people organizing, the courage of people being tactical and strategic, the power of using what we had to get the outcomes we wanted. And then even more importantly was or just as important was the power of the press, the general press. When folks saw Elizabeth Eckford getting surrounded by a mob, that changed people's minds. It made people want to support a little more. When they saw the riots to happen down there in Oxford, Mississippi, when James Meredith was on his way in there, saying, man, this is what's going on down in Dixie. This is what's happening. When they saw Emmett Till in that casket, the role of the press really changed it. And then as you start talking about more of Little Rock and Ole Miss, TV still in its infancy was airing this stuff on the news now. And you'll see later how the media and people and laws were used to leverage other civil rights outcomes. So, we're really starting to get to a head here where we're starting to see one side really start to pick up some momentum and some steam as far as civil rights is concerned, and another side starting to wise up a bit, but also not letting go of their grip on what they feel is theirs. Systemic barriers persist. The impact of social economic factors persist. And so you're headed into, what will be our next steps in our fight here. And we'll get to that here as we move forward. So now I want to leave some time for some questions, if there are any. And then we can talk about next steps and what next week will look like. And then we can get y'all out of here to enjoy the rest of your beautiful Sunday. Well, if it's beautiful where you are. It started beautiful here, but it's now starting to gloom up a little bit. So while we wait for the questions to populate, if there are any, next week, we are taking our fight to continue it with students, but not necessarily in the classroom. Next week, we'll talk about the sit-ins. So the Greensboro sit-in, the Nashville sit-ins. We'll talk about the Albany movement, which was an impasse for the civil rights fighters. And then I believe the March on Washington. And if not, then it'll just be more about sit-ins. So just to give a quick primer on there. So students started to see, oh man, this is happening in Little Rock. This is what's happening at Ole Miss. Oh man, we have power. We can leverage. And in Greensboro is one of my favorite cases because they were kind of the stepchild of the movement in that one, they started before SNCC. They started to get press. They started to maneuver before not SNCC. Yeah, they were SNCC, but the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee wasn't even a thing yet when 4 young men from Greensboro said, you know what, we about to test this equal protection under the law as it relates to dining accommodations. And then we'll look at what happened in Nashville as they took the lessons from Greensboro and navigated a sit-in protest. And these are students, college students. So people without a mortgage yet, people without a job yet, people who aren't in high school, but people who are growing their philosophical ideas and moving forward. So really good conversations around the sit-ins. And then Albany. Albany was a very interesting case for Albany, Georgia. Was a very interesting case because there was organizing happening in Albany. Same as everywhere else, equal rights, equal this, equal that. But in Albany, the powers that be, the federal government got hit, or not the state governments and the city governments got hip to some of the tactics that Dr. King, the SELC were using, and they kind of outsmarted that version of civil rights kind of planning and action, which led to a really key swinging momentum victory, or a swinging momentum situation for Birmingham, which came right after Albany. So we're starting to see this teeter between the movement ticking up and starting to get its wings and starting to really grasp what it's needing to do city by city. And then these municipalities saying, you want us to do this. We're not going to do it this time, or we'll have a plan for what you're doing. And we won't give the media what they're looking for. And we won't, do this and that. So we'll see student rising, we'll see tactics rising, and we'll see civil rights laws passed, voting rights laws passed, etc. Media was an unsung hero during civil rights. Facts. Facts. And then just think about it. All the case footage we've seen, TV was in its infancy. See, it was such an interesting mix. If you follow just U.S. history, and I'm not doing a lot of that, I'm kind of keeping it more on our side this time. That's how Kennedy won. Being able to put that face on the TV and be seen, and the Bay of Pigs and how that played out, and Cuba, all these. TV was really starting to be a key figure in how we move. Let me see here. But the government closing down departments and giving rights back to state governments could cause, even as we see, so it's funny. States' rights has always been a core part of our country. If you go back to, and we didn't cover this in class, but I'll just do a quick one here. If you go back to the founding of our country at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the Whigs and all these other ones, but the big fight was between, where does power lie? Who should have the say-so? Who should have this movement? And there was more details in the Ole Miss case that kind of shows this. So in the Ole Miss case, and I kind of ran by it, but I'm glad you mentioned that so I can go back a little bit. One of the things that the governor did is the governor, and this was a law, the governor tried to use, when this is Meredith's second attempt, he tried to use the pre-Civil War doctrine of imposition, saying that the states may interpose itself between the national government in an issue. But the federal government, which, got the high class, high type lawyers as well, said, well, no, that was beat by the supremacy clause. And the supremacy clause said the states' issues may persist, but the federal government outweighs that. And so that was an issue there. Even with the Little Rock case, well, we as a state can do this, says this in our Constitution. Well, the Fed said, well, no. And so what we've been seeing in political theater over the last few years is, even with the Department of Education, give back to the states. Let the states decide. So imagine if the states could have decided Little Rock. Imagine if the states could have decided Ole Miss. Imagine if the states could have decided Birmingham. You know what I'm saying? Like, those, to your point, those outcomes wouldn't have been what we wanted them to see, because the leaders, the governors, the legislatures, the state courts all leaned in a certain perspective that believed in a certain thing. So Dr. Lysandra, you're right about that. And man, you are right about that, about the press. So as we move forward, we're gearing up to week 3 next week, where we talk about the sit-ins and seeing how students are really starting to find their way. That's why I call this one Battlefield Classroom, because you saw high school students endure. We saw James Meredith, another, Army man, but he was a student enduring. So as we move forward in our conversation, we're going to get deeper into what's going on now as these protests start to persist. You're really starting to see the indignation come from the South. You start to see more people getting their hands put on them. You start to see the philosophy of nonviolence really start to breed itself, because now, we're not just walking on a bus. Now we're not just trying to get into a school and with federal oversight over us. Now we're sitting at a lunch counter where people can come in and do whatever they want. It's a public place. So we really see how people were taught nonviolence, how they were trained in nonviolence, and how they actually executed nonviolence, and how some of these personalities and people are starting to change. This week, we ain't talk a lot about Dr. King. We ain't talk a lot about the SELC. We ain't talk a lot about that, but we will moving forward. So we're starting to see some of these different names and faces and people start to have a bigger role in these hyper-local movements. and how they all, come together. And then as we move forward past that, we'll start to look at, especially as now we're into the 60s, we get to see more of how TV and how policy and how the change of rhetoric can really start to change the movement. So just to make a long story short, I'll say this. The plight of those students were inspiring for me to go back and look at when I was putting the course together. And as I think about, what's going on with the students who were at U of M protesting, and we're getting arrested over this weekend, we're starting to see a lot of that stuff happening. What we saw during the election with the around college campuses. Students usually carry the revolution one way or the other, for the good side or for the bad side. So we're living these times. And if you ever had to wonder, what would I have been doing during civil rights movement? Well, whatever you're doing now is probably what you would have been doing then. So this is our opportunity to either, one, ensure that we are at least in the fight, in the information fight, in the philosophy fight, in the educating yourself fight, in preparing for whatever is coming, supporting those who are in this movement, and finding a way to get active however you can. For me right now, it's information. I want to share this information. I want to ensure that people have it. I want to make sure that you can't say, well, I didn't know. Well, I can drop you some links and I'll get you some information, because we all going to have to get active and get outside in one shape or another very soon. And then I also want to say this. I think that moving forward, as custom, I'm going to drop the link to or the outline of this class, drop the links to the videos, some links to some other really good information for you to continue your own search, your own study. And we're going to be doing this again next week, next Sunday at 3. I want to thank everybody that was here today. I want to thank everybody that posed questions or wanted to, those who signed up, those who watched the videos. You can go to my Facebook page and you can see the promo videos that I put up. You can they have a Facebook group I'm going to put into the letter that's the outline that's going out early next week. And then we'll be back next week talking sit-ins, man, and getting knee deep in this thing. And it's only been 1 hour and 12 and we have 5 minutes up front to start. So I'm getting good on my timing. I want to again thank everybody. My goal this time was to talk about less per class, to give us more time to talk about them and to have more video, more interaction, and more ways to say I walked away and I actually understood something, instead of piling so much into the lecture that you didn't even get one. Because last semester it would have been, last week and this week it would have all been in one, with U.S. history, with contemporary, you know what I'm saying? So this time I really wanted us to take a moment to center in on this information. I appreciate everybody for being here. We'll be back next week, 3 o'clock, where we'll be talking student sit-ins, Greensboro, and in Nashville. And I believe we're doing Albany and Birmingham as well. If not, then that'll be the next week. So I want to thank you for your time. This is Dwayne Barnes, MPA. What did my man say? Thank you for coming out. God bless and good night. I'll see y'all next week. Peace.